Welcome to the January 29, 2013 Prince George's County Board of Education Fiscal Year 2014 Proposed Operating Budget Work Session. Before I begin, please turn off your wireless communications as they tend to interfere with the taping of the meeting. Ms. Jackson, call the roll, please.
Mr. Burrows, Ms. Epps, Ms. Eubanks.
Here.
Ms. Fellows, Ms. Higgins.
Aye.
Ms. Waller, Ms. Ahmed, Ms. Boston.
Here.
Ms. Jacobs.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. The Board of Education has convened this evening for the sole purpose of discussing the FY 2014 proposed operating budget by Interim Superintendent Crawley. We appreciate your participation in the FY 2014 budget process. Only with the public's involvement will we be able to craft a financial plan that best suits the needs of our students. Superintendent Crawley's proposal is designed to further the vision of the Prince George's County Public Schools in that all students will acquire the knowledge, skills, and behaviors to be college and career ready. Through the budget work sessions and public hearings, we will fine-tune the plan as appropriate to ensure that we focus on our key priorities, which are as follows: funding student needs, supporting our employees, continued investment in innovative programs, and continued fiscal stability. The purpose of the budget work sessions is to ensure that the budget process remains student-focused, equitable, transparent, and flexible. At this time, I would turn this over to Dr. Alvin Crawley for presentation of the proposed budget for FY 2014.
Thank you, Board Member Chair Jacobs. Tonight we're pleased to provide the Board with information related to the fiscal year 2014 proposed budget through this work session. This evening we would like to cover a number of areas with the Board as a part of this work session. We'd like to provide you with some updated information related to revenue projection, talk to you about the Superintendent's revised 2014 proposed budget, which includes the Governor's proposed budget, and tonight we'll also focus on business management services, supporting services, and then review our requested budget timeline. As we look at the fiscal year 2014 budget, we had originally a superintendent's proposed budget of $1.679 billion. And as a result of additional information, that number has been revised to $1.687 billion. In terms of explanation of the variance, I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Sheeran, to review this information with the Board.
Thank you, Dr. Crawley. Board members. The slide on the screen is pretty straightforward. We've been fortunate to have some increases from the state. You can see it's about 1%. There's been increase in the foundation program, also in transportation aid, as well as compensatory education for students that are disadvantaged. Likewise, there's an adjustment for the non-public placement revenue stream, and there's also a decrease based on recent estimates from the county, totaling about $7.7 million. Those are estimates that are tied to downward revisions in what's happening with both the telecommunications tax as well as the energy tax.
Thank you, Mr. Sheeran. I'd like to talk a bit about the variance in terms of the difference between the superintendent's proposed budget presented in December and where we are now in terms of our revenues as we look at fiscal year 2014. Since the December presentation, we have an increase in funds that will be available to us in the amount of about $7.8 million. And so as we look at these funds, I'd like to provide some recommendations to the Board for consideration. And the first recommendation is, as we look at compensation, certainly we know that it's important to work towards a compensation system for our employees that have been working diligently with us over the years. And so there's a recommendation of $5 million to be dedicated towards compensation that would be in addition to the funds that were recommended through the proposed budget. There's been a lot of discussion about security and safety in our schools, and certainly we want to make sure that we are implementing not only our safety procedures and protocols, but if there are additional things that we need to do to ensure that our schools continue to be safe, we want to add to those resources. And so there is a recommendation of adding $1 million to be dedicated to additional safety security procedures or resources within schools. At the last board meeting, we talked about Greenbelt Middle School and opening that program as a part of French immersion. And so there's a recommendation of the 9.0 positions that we talked about in order to make the transition and provide adequate supports to the students and staff in that building, and that would result in 5.0 custodians and 4.0 food service workers. The remainder of staff would transition as a part of the existing program. The next recommendation is to increase our student-based budgeting fund in the amount of $1.3 million. And these funds would provide direct support to our schools to continue to allow them to provide a strong instructional program for students. And so the revised superintendent's proposed budget would be $1.687 billion. Tonight we will focus on business management services, and within the Chief Financial Office, the goal is to make sure that we maintain financial stability and integrity in the distribution, implementation, and use of resources throughout the district. As we look at specific costs that are impacted as part of our fiscal year 2014 operations, we see a $2.0 million increase in workmen's compensation, our health insurance, $9.8 million, and then retiree health at $5.2 million. Under the Chief Administrator for Supporting Services, we have a 1% decrease in the cost associated with lease purchase due to the renegotiation of lease purchase contracts. And this is a direct result of our energy initiative where we have renegotiated a lower percentage rate or interest rate. In transportation, as you know, we've had a number of challenges this year that have resulted in making some adjustments in our transportation, and so as a part of those adjustments, we had to increase the number of bus drivers as well as support lease purchase of new buses. And so the 7.3 increase is a direct reflection of our transportation needs and looking at next year and to make sure that our students are transported to school in a safe, reliable manner and on time. And then finally, as we look at our food services and the operations of our food services program, there's a 3.5% increase in the subsidy for our food services program. And the majority of these increases are tied to some salary increases or in positions. So as we go forward as part of this budget process, just to remind the board and our community, today we have the budget work session, and then at 7 o'clock we'll have a public hearing here in the boardroom. On February 13th, another budget work session at 5 o'clock, followed by a public hearing here in the boardroom. February 19th, a budget work session, public hearing. On February 21st, the Board of Education meeting, adoption of the requested budget. And then finally, on March 1st, 2013, a Board of Education requested budget submission to the county executive. As part of the budget process, questions were submitted by board members, and so staff has had an opportunity to respond to those questions. We would be more than happy to respond to any questions or specific questions from board members.
Thank you, Dr. Crowley. You want to go first? Ms. Higgins.
Thank you very much. I have a few. Well, let me ask on page 3, just, I think it's probably, well, they're probably all simple questions, but the superintendent's proposed budget and then the revised budget of county contribution was reduced by $7 million, right? It was my understanding, though, that the county had to provide maintenance of effort. So why are we reducing the county contribution $7 million if we're required to they're required to provide maintenance of effort?
Appreciate that question. There is a maintenance of effort formula, and it's in that formula is where you find that difference, because what you start off with is the highest contribution, and then you actually subtract out a number of items such as recurring costs, the telecommunication tax, and the energy tax, which gives you a net number. And then, as part of the formula, as it goes in sequence, you then add enrollment growth resources, which gives you basically what is then the state share. You then take that to the next level, where you're then looking at what the increase would be in order to meet the MOE, and then through that adding and subtracting of what the telecommunication tax is to get to the MOE is how you then add back the new revised level of tax, both telecommunication and energy tax, to get to the net number. So you're starting, you're subtracting, you're getting a net, then you put in a new number, you add and subtract to come back to another net. So it's a sort of a stepwise formula that I can show you offline.
No, I've heard enough about it. Thanks.
Okay.
But my question then is it then it's not an absolute number? It's really, you say the different kinds of taxes, et cetera, will influence. So
That's correct.
The maintenance of effort has to do with a percentage or a formula as opposed to an absolute number.
That's correct.
Okay. So then my other question then regarding that is that I understand that we got $15 million more than we were expecting from the state. So why wouldn't we just kind of keep that $7 million and request it from the county rather than reduce our request by $7 million? I'm sure I'm one of 9 who could help find ways to enhance our programming.
That question you're raising is a very good one for the board, because at this point in the process, the board is putting together its requested proposal. So what administration is doing is putting together the best information that we can tied to the data that's out there. But as far as that option, that's clearly an option for the board.
Okay, well, that'll work for me. Let me ask a couple other questions. I think you made clear about the transportation issues, and I think all of us are very familiar with those. I'm not sure that here it is, on the PowerPoint page 5. The negotiated compensation, I think that's pretty clear. That has to do with putting monies aside for negotiating with our labor partners. The school security initiative, as we look at school security, are we looking in the broadest context, which means how students are interacting with each other in course of emphasizing and promoting our bullying programs or our anti-bullying programs, peer mediation, PBIS, those kinds? Or when we talk about school security initiative, are we solely talking about external people coming into our building?
So that's a good question. Actually, as part of taking a comprehensive look at school safety, we're looking programmatically as well as other security measures that we need to put in place to make sure that our schools are safe. From the program side of things, certainly as part of the work that, for example, Student Services does, and we implement anti-bullying initiatives. So we would look at ways in which to promote students getting along, working together, character education, and all of those initiatives that go with conflict resolution. And certainly within the district, a number of our schools are implementing the PBIS And so those efforts would continue and be supported through our resources. And then as part of the 1.0, we would look at additional steps that we would take to make sure that our schools are actually physically, in terms of the facilities, that they're safe. And so on at the next board meeting, we're scheduled to come back to you with some short-term recommendations around safety and security, and then some long-term measures. And as a part of those recommendations, we'll talk to you about the fiscal impact of those decisions. And so we've recommended allocating the 1.0 million as a way of looking at resources that might be available to fund some of these initiatives.
Just one follow-up then. So then the the $1 million has to do with addressing the maybe restricting access at certain buildings, those kinds of things,
Right.
in terms of providing security.
So some of the things we'll talk about are visitor management systems
Yes.
related to cameras or buzzers or swipe cards and other things that
Okay.
would have a fiscal impact within our schools.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Boston?
I think you've answered one of my questions, so I can cross that off my list. On the student-based budgeting, is that, I think 1.3 million, is that kind of in line with the same amount that we put in reserve last year for or is this additional, because after a result of this year and looking at where we might have fell short, we feel that we need additional money in that?
Yes, ma'am. We need lots of additional money.
Okay.
We are running our weights with the exact same amount of money. The way we're running it, the way we run the algorithms, was assuming no increase in SPB. So any dollar that you put in SPB will actually go to weights. And what we would like to do is we would like to put the money towards weights around student performance. So a student who is a double basic, they've been basic in reading and math, would have a higher weight than a student who was basic and proficient. So our goal is the more money we get, the more money we can put towards kids around performance. And then that money could then be used to buy interventions. It could be for increased staffing, but yeah, we really would like to put more money in that.
So am I hearing you correctly? So you're proposing to increase the weights that we had last year?
I'm proposing that we increase the weights around student performance.
Okay. In just that category?
Yes, ma'am.
Around the student performance?
And I'll take as much money as you can give me.
So, and then the rest will go in the reserves, because last year we put reserves in. I want to make sure
Yes,
that we
ma'am.
continue to do that.
So
because of
the way we're playing right now, I'm looking at about 4.1 million in reserve to do balancing. I wouldn't mind that one a little bit bigger, but if you approve this increase, I would put it in weights today. And any increases that you improve over the time, I'd like to increase both my pool balance, but I want to put more money in the weights. I really want to make a difference for kids who are really struggling. I want principals to have some real options, and I don't feel like the way the current budget is, they have a lot of options. It's going to be kind of status quo unless I can put some more money in that.
Okay. Now, in the increase for negotiations, is this 5 million, is this an addition to what we already have budgeted for negotiations, or this is on top?
Yes, this would be in addition to what was in the superintendent's proposed budget. I believe it was around 11.9 million.
So we're looking at now about 16.
Right.
Now, like I said, I thought you might have answered this question, but I'm going to ask it again. On that 1.3 on the, not the 1.3, on the security, yeah. Is this for additional FTEs, or is this, or are we looking at more or less programs or projects that you're trying to put in place? I mean, what exactly is this increase for? You might have answered that question, but...
The security money would be to implement some specific facilities actions within schools. For example, one of the recommendations might be to make sure that all of our schools have a visual monitoring system of when people come through the door, or we might decide to have a panic button. I'm just sharing some examples with you of things that will come forward to you for consideration as part of the February meeting. So we're not exactly talking about staff, although there are some recommendations that would have some additional security staff involved in it.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Crawley, can you, on the non-public placements, so what did the state do? Did they increase their contribution compared to what we were used to? I think last year there was a debate about whether it should be 60-40 or whatever. Did they, and how did they come to that in terms of the non-public placements?
Madam Chair, last year the state gave us some strong indicators that they were going to change those percentages,
Right.
but they really didn't materialize. And so during our budget process, we actually took that information and we set aside in a reserve some funding for non-public placement because we had the indicators, but it didn't materialize. So now we're moving that money and reprogramming it into other areas that we can use that set aside more instructionally for those different reasons.
So this increase is representative of funds that we set aside?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so by moving it into the current, do you feel like there's a need for it? In other words, are you now not going to have a set aside for the non-public placements depending on what the state may do in the future? Or do we know yet that they're not going to, they haven't suggested that they're going to do anything different?
So that indication was when we were building the current year's budget.
Right.
And so it hasn't materialized, so that we now realize that the money that we had there can be reprogrammed. So for 14, when we were analyzing different programs to see where revenue was available to do different things, we identified that and we were able to reprogram it into other instructional areas.
Okay. On the county contribution, the telecommunications tax, what was the process for that? Usually the council struggles around whether it belongs to the school system or not. We know that was on the ballot, and it didn't pass, so that gave the council more discretion, I guess. Is this a discretionary issue that the council decided you're not going to get the 7.7? I mean, you're not going to get that contribution for telecommunications tax?
My understanding is that as we went through in working with the county to get better revenue estimates, that's the result that we...
Okay, so it's not based on a reduction, it's based on better estimates for what comes in through the
I believe that's
telecommunications
true.
and
Yes.
the energy tax?
Yes.
Okay. You sure about that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right, I just want to make sure. And then in so the student-based budgeting fund, what's the current reserve without the 1.3?
4.1?
We're looking at 4.1.
And last year, we started, well, we went back and forth several times. I think at one point we had about $8 million.
That's
I believe
correct.
that's correct.
Okay, so what have we looked at from last year to this year that makes us comfortable that we've cut that in half?
So we're actually thinking we're getting better at the algorithm, but 4.1 is cutting it very, very tight.
Right, so, yeah, because I think, and we have projections about what we think enrollment is going to be. Obviously, we don't know what happens until the first week of school. But, so this would increase, the 1.3 would bring it to then 5.4, essentially?
It would result in the 5.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's something to look at. And then
And Ms.
on-
Jacobs, just
Yes.
we did balance the budget with SPP. So whether we put it in the weights or we put it into the reserve, we came out with a balanced budget. So, and we're dealing with the same amount of money this year. So, but it doesn't give us any leeway.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I was going.
Yeah.
Because last year we were talking about, are we going to have to, if we have a class size of whatever, we're going to be able to do what we need to do. And we had to maneuver that so much. On the I want to come back to the workers' comp, health insurance, and retiree health. On the transportation issue, so I got your explanation. We had, we have to have, I remember the buses that weren't refurbished and state gave us an extension. I remember all that. What are the takeaways from the Transportation Task Force from a budget perspective and where we are now, other than just, so in other words, all the recommendations, all the work of the task force, I think needs to be explained further. I mean, it is what it is. So I want to hear exactly what some of the issues were around that. So are we talking about just the purchase of new buses and the salaries, or are we also talking about the routing problems and things like that? So what does this $7.3 million mean?
So and I'll ask staff to weigh in. The majority of the 7.3 that we're talking about is a result of the addition of 100 buses, as well, I think it's 144 replacement buses.
Correct.
And then the additional 100 bus drivers that we needed. Certainly there are lessons learned related to what happened this year in terms of implementation of our transportation system. In the context of that task force report, there are a number of recommendations that are in there in terms of looking at routes and making changes in bus stops, as well as working with the county and looking at sidewalks and access to our schools. So we're going to continue to look at the task force report, and I would suspect that a number of the recommendations that are in there we will continue to implement, and then there are others that I think we're going to have to take a look at and perhaps fund and support in a different way beyond what was recommended in the task force report.
So just as a follow-up, if we didn't have the Transportation Task Force report, would this number be different? You still need the 100 buses, right?
I think in absence of that report, we see a clear need to add bus drivers to meet our transportation demands. And certainly, we're required to implement a bus replacement process, and some of that was deferred. And now we need to do it as a school division. So I would say, yes, these are two recommendations that we would still need to address in some form.
That's so to have, okay, I'm sorry, my time is up. I'll come back. Ms. Beck.
I'm sorry for being late, but I just spent 3 days with 700 board members from across the country, where we had what I'll describe as a begathon relating to sequestration. And we spent all day up on the Hill visiting our elected officials, begging for that money. Now, I want to thank the budget staff because I sent questions so that I would have better clarity when I was in these meetings, and I'll include those on, I'll include the questions that I sent so that they can be shared with everyone. Now, in terms of the sequestration decline to now 5.1%, that's $3.7 million additional, right? Because we had already reduced the federal aid by the almost $10 million initially. So is it correct to say that $3.7 million is now going back into this federal aid line if sequestration percentage is lower?
It's kind of hard to answer that because the sequestration is kind of a moving target. We know,
hopefully moving down.
Correct, but we don't know when it will actually be implemented.
Right.
And so we're anticipating it may affect current year, FY-13. As it affects FY-14, we have that reserved assignment of resources in the fund balance for sequestration, depending on what it does and how it actually manifests itself, affecting either Title I or some other federal program. So we're trying to position the district
So that we're
in
not
both
cut.
cases, both
Okay.
current year as well as next year.
So if it's current year and we've reserved too much, now that we were told by Secretary Duncan that the new number's in the low 5%. So
Okay.
I took that to the bank if he's going to say that, right? And I could see all the other board members immediately, what does this mean for me, going back to their districts? So that money would come out of the reserve back into play. Is that the right understanding?
Well, there's a couple of steps. If it's 5%, we currently have about $120 million in federal money. If that 5% of 120 goes across the board, and that's just then a sort of a mandate or a directive that we would have to comply with, the reserve's not going to come close to covering 5% of 120 million. We didn't have enough resources to offset a magnitude of a change of the federal government basically creating a whole lot of unfunded mandates because they're getting out of a lot of different businesses, education being one of them. So that's sort of some background piece. Secondly, in order to actually use the dollars that we have reserved for sequestration into fund balance, this board would have to get a recommendation from the superintendent, act on it, forward it to the county government for consideration and approval.
To pull it back into play?
Correct.
Okay, that was the piece that I needed to know. We received copies of the questions that PGCEA submitted. Will we be going over those line by line? Because a lot of those questions were really ones that I'm interested in having a fuller discussion on, especially the 8% increase in the maintenance of plant and we just looked at the transportation briefly, but the PGCEA question kind of delves into the transportation dollar amounts a little tighter. So your plan is to just respond to the PGCEA questions, post them online, or can we pull them onto the table for the next work session?
Go ahead.
We've already prepared written responses to each one of the questions, and I believe it's on board docs.
Okay.
Ms. Beck, my recommendation would be that we sort of study those questions and responses, and as we need additional information or want the administration to delve further into it or do a more public response, that we ask those specifically.
Okay.
I think there was a number of questions submitted through PGC.
Right, and a lot of those questions would obliterate what I would be asking. Yeah,
I would also
because they
add-
were very in-depth.
And I would also add that within the response, I think one of the pieces of information that would be helpful to the board is the chart that shows the actual number of positions by group, and certainly PGCA would be part of that, by collective bargaining unit. For example, if you look at the 8%, you'll see that what's driving a lot of that is the increase in terms of the bus drivers, and then some of our negotiated agreements that we are held to from a legal perspective.
Okay, and, I'm sorry, I'm done. My time is up. I have a minute. There was a specific question about the additional non-instructional positions, 300. Yeah.
348.
So that is the chart you're referring to that's, okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
I have not looked at that because I've been with 700 of my colleagues from across the nation.
Ms. Beck, I did want to add, just to go back a second to sequestration. This is something that we've been following very closely on the admin team, and certainly as the numbers start to shift, and we started with the 8%, and now we're getting recent information around 5%. But we've actually formed a committee of staff to just monitor and follow sequestration, and certainly our budget team is a part of that process, our Title I folks, special education, to make sure that we're not only looking at the immediate challenges associated with sequestration, but we're looking down the road in terms of what may happen, 2 years, 3 years, and positioning ourselves so that we remain healthy fiscally as an organization.
And that, I'm sorry, that might need to be a fuller discussion. And I know we've had a discussion briefly on sequestration, and we had the resolution on it. But I think taking it by category might be more helpful to explain it to the community, because I didn't realize the actual line items that were in play. And then when we got the briefing the other day, it's very dramatic, the effect that it could have on our kids, because we have so many kids with special needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. Ms. Higgins?
Thank you. I'd like to go back to make sure that I'm understanding, following up with Ms. Jacobs' questions regarding the county contribution of $7 million. So if I'm understanding the conversation now, it's that the $7 million was reduced because of the numbers in terms of that formula, not, and that was the where it came from. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it's not like we cut their contribution by $7 million because we had the state $15 million, so we could ask back that $7 million.
No, ma'am.
So it's not like found money. Ah, darn. Okay, just want to make sure I understood Ms. Jacobs. Yeah, I was hoping. You knew I was hoping. Yeah, right. So can I also ask then a follow-up as well to the student-based budgeting question? Dr. Arbogast, you're saying that 1.3 then would increase the dollar amount on the weights of the current student-based budgeting formula, correct?
Yes, ma'am. My priority would be any funds that are restored to that would first go to the weights and then would go to the pool. So what we want to do is we want to, as a matter of fact, we ran some numbers this afternoon, and we want the IDs to meet with principals who have potential loss and see what is the impact. And if the impact is too great, that's how we use the pool to fix that. But our purpose is to actually put more money towards student performance so that schools can actually be really creative and address the needs of students. And what we're proposing is, so state test reading and math, right, 2 tests. So it's double basic, single basic, and then double advanced. And the weights would go in that priority order. So there's an incentive for kids to score really well, but we'd like to create a pretty heavy weight for double basics and a single basic.
So the pool money is for if there's unbalance
Yes,
in
ma'am.
regards to the number of students, then we could hire more teachers or move teachers
Exactly.
to...
Sometimes you have 2 large class sizes in adjacent grades, we can create a combination class.
Right.
That's easy. It doesn't cost us money. But if the large class sizes are 2 grades, like it's 3rd and 5th grade,
Right.
I can't create a combination class. I have to get another teacher, and that's how we use the pool.
And
So all those kind of situations, circumstances where this solution just wasn't evident to us.
So that's where you're saying about the 5.3 million, 1.3 to kind of address the weights,
Yes, ma'am.
improve the
And-
weights, and then 4 million to be able to deal with the imbalance.
Right, and we're trying, and as Board Member Jacobs said, we had about $8 million last year, but we tried to
Yeah.
correct a lot of that in our formulas this year. So, for example, the small school subsidy we changed, and that's what cost a lot of that $8 million.
Okay. Did we spend all that 8 million? Did we need to spend that 8 million for balancing that issue?
So, from my perspective, yes, we needed all of it, but does every dollar get spent? The answer is probably no. For example, if there's a vacancy, that's money we're not spending. So, yeah, we felt like we had covered all the bases by mid-September, but as you know, through fund balance, monies don't always get spent for a variety of reasons.
Right, yes. If I could just ask one follow-up. Last year was the first time we went across the system on student-based budgeting. Do we not have tweaking to do in terms of where the weights are with that?
Yes,
or
ma'am.
where-
I suspect we'll be tweaking for the next 10 years. And the
Okay.
tweaking comes not only in the weights, but in the locked and unlocked positions. Now, when you look at other fair student formulas around the nation, most systems unlock more positions than we do. We've been very, very cautious in unlocking positions, and principals are getting it, and they're now requesting, can you unlock parent liaisons? Can you unlock peer mediators? And we're trying to accommodate that. And then we want to start looking at, okay, here's a good example. In the budget, we've increased money around secondary school reform. Okay? So we want to add some program coordinators around secondary school reform. Should that be a locked position or an unlocked position? Should the central office say how those positions should be hired, or should we say, take that money and put it in SBB and say to the principal, you need to implement this academy, and we've added extra dollars. So those are the tweakings that are going to continue over the next couple of years as we grow to be more autonomy at the principal level. It's our theory of action, but our practice has been much more cautious.
So last time, the elementary school principals had many more positions as locked positions than middle or high school. That's what I recall. You look like that may not be accurate. You didn't see a delineation
No, I mean,
that way.
we locked custodians, we locked nurses, we locked .5 media specialists. I mean, those are the things that we locked.
Right.
But all levels had their series of locked positions, and also all of our specialty program positions are locked. And the principals are now starting to think, do you really need to lock, say, a program coordinator for TAG or Montessori or VPA? Can we start having some flexibility around that? And we've been, in theory, we say yes, but in practice, we have to balance the collective bargaining agreement, we have to balance HR practices, we have to balance what the budget says we can do. So these are all the considerations as we try to move forward. But we are really trying to move forward to more autonomy at the principal level, more unlocked positions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am.
Ms. Higgins, I just wanted to just mention, you asked about taking a look, and Dr. Arbogast talked about the next 10 years. And I think, quite honestly, as we look at student-based budgeting, every year is an opportunity for reflection and improvement in terms of the work and how it plays out in large schools, how it plays out in small schools, and in terms of how we provide supports. And then, more importantly, it goes to the issue of equity and access to opportunities, and making sure that as we implement student-based budgeting, that we're providing those opportunities evenly across the school district.
Ms. Eubanks?
I like waiting last. That way I don't have to ask as many questions. My questions are normally already answered. But I'd like to say one thing in reference to school security, because I know for the last couple of years we had already had a shortage. So the amount that you're proposing, that will cover additional persons, because I know all of the other things you're talking about doing, but that will actually cover more personnel as well.
In the original proposed budget, there are some positions in there. I think we had a couple of middle schools that we were adding security. I'm going to ask Ms. Golson to respond.
Yeah, correct. We will be adding for some middle schools that security services realized that we needed to add an additional security assistant to.
I just wanted it on the record because I'm still hearing that a lot, so
Yes.
I just wanted to put that out there. But this has nothing, well, the next thing has nothing to do with that, but it's just a follow-up. While I was sitting here and we were talking about budget, I was reminded that Mr. Lucci brought to us last year a proposal to bring the speed cameras to our school system, and we as the board, we said it's fine, but what is the school system going to get from that? And I don't see anywhere where we've gotten the percentage that we're supposed to get, and I wanted that on the record as well, and so that someone can follow up on that and find out what are we benefiting from that. Okay.
Duly noted, and we'll follow up.
Yeah, just so we're just for clarity purposes, yeah, when we talked about it last year, of course, the bill did not include that we would get any funds from it. Obviously, safety and security is important, and we put that forth saying, we think that's a great idea. Don't let it just go to the general fund, bring some of that money to us. So that's a good follow-up. So when we look at negotiated compensation, I think that, so I really want the district to be really strategic about negotiating agreements for this next coming session. And so the only way you can really be strategic about it is if you do the research and are really, really informed. So I really would like to see, because we've had the challenges we've had over the last 3 years or so around budget, I'd like to see some of the comparisons around compensation variances that's obviously happened since we've had the cuts that we've had. I want to see what they look like in comparison. So last year, I think the board got a regional breakdown of the per student costs by district. So it was, when I say, it was Loudoun County, Prince George's, Montgomery, Fairfax. It didn't just include Maryland. But that breakdown showed us how different districts, the amount of money that different districts were paying per pupil. And then we also got a report about unit cost. So we were able to look at, what are the unit costs for the district. And we were told at that time from the administration that we should be able to take that kind of a report and use unit costs for almost everything in the system. So where I'm going with that, when we're talking about negotiated agreements, I'd like to really be able to see for all the labor organizations, but obviously the teachers union has really been we've been on the forefront around the evaluation process. We were on the forefront with the FIRST program. We're on all these different processes that's been put in place. What does that look like? All this work has been put in from our district, and it's recognized across the region and the country. What does that look like for us now compared to other districts from a compensation perspective? Not just the teachers union, but also our principals union. So I guess what I'm getting at is when we really talk about strategy for negotiations, I'd like to actually see what are we basing our negotiating options on. We noticed that in this district at year 5, teachers are being paid this. Therefore, this is what we propose to the board that we bring to the table, as an example. And then we also had a discussion about the number of custodial staff in the buildings based on the size of the school. So I guess what I'm getting at is I really want to see the administration, because to me, being able to approve or not the amount for reserves should be based on what our needs are. And that goes to that whole conversation that we've been having about what's non-negotiable. So we need to set priorities for negotiations, and I think the only way we can do that is to know what we're looking at. Does that sound too complicated?
No, it doesn't.
I didn't
And I agree with you in terms of looking at the unit cost and our work with our collective bargaining units. Just as a reminder to the board, as part of the proposed fiscal year 2014 budget, I presented some data to the board based on the Washington Area Boards of Education study that's conducted annually, and part of that study looks at the per pupil expenditure per district as well as the average teacher salary, and in both instances, factoring in the 10 districts, we were number 6.
I do remember that, Dr. Crawley. I think what I'm thinking about is actually doing so over the last 3 years, yes. Where were we 3 years ago? Where are we now? And where were those districts 3 years ago? And where are they now? Even though we end up as number 6, I want to see what the differences were across that period. What were the changes? When we weren't doing tuition reimbursement, were other districts doing tuition reimbursement? When we weren't doing, those kinds of things, were they doing it? Because we keep hearing that, everybody's struggling financially, but that we were the only district or only one of a few districts that stopped certain things. We also know that some of it was associated with the reform efforts that we've talked about. So where are we now? And then there's a state, PSTEB, I can't think of that. You might know, Dr. Arby. PSTEB is a state study by MSDE, the governor's office, and there's some boards of education, I think some superintendents are on it, and what they're looking at is the teacher tenure and the associations for higher degrees. What are the requirements? And they actually have struggled over the report, which should be coming out soon. They've struggled because they're trying to determine whether or not, because of the conversation of tying student outcomes to these things. But I think if we're in a negotiating process, we need to know, we need to have a philosophy around those things in order to know what the priorities are. And I don't mean to beat it to death. I just don't want us to go into negotiations, set aside a dollar amount because it's this magic number. I think it should mean something.
So what you're really talking about is compensation reform. And we were in a very, very good spot with our collective bargaining units around compensation reform. They're reading the same research. We're reading. Our goal and vision are very, very similar. But in order to do compensation reform, both parties have to negotiate from a position of strength. In other words, people have had to get their raises. It's when you're in a position of weakness, it's very, very difficult to talk about compensation reform when there's no money to reform. So we've had open conversations with our bargaining units around compensation reform. We have actually a project in Race to the Top around studying compensation reform. We have a contract with Educational Research Strategies to help us with compensation reform. So, but the way we've paid people over the last couple, or not paid people over the last couple of years, has put us in a position of weakness, and we want to return to a position of strength. I would argue, and talking to our colleagues around the state, Baltimore City pushed out really far, but Prince George's County is really poised to have a legitimate conversation around compensation reform. We have the right partners at the table. We just have to move that work forward. And you're right. We have to re-examine teacher effectiveness. We have to re-examine salary lanes. We have to re-examine what experience actually means. And we have to re-examine what roles and leadership our people have in the building and then compensate according to that. So I'm very, very excited about it. But the process is very slow.
Okay, so, and I don't disagree. And not repeating myself, so let me make sure I don't say the same thing. I think the point mainly is around compensation reform, but it really is also, over the last few years, the last two opportunities that we had that we wouldn't have otherwise had to give a small something to our employees was based on, this is all we got, so we're trying to give you something. I'm just saying that now, if we're going to set aside, let's make it tie it to something. At least bring some of those kinds of things back to us to say, we want to have this go to this, and this is why we want to have this as the priority from the board presented to the union. Okay. Anybody else? Ms. Boston?
I just wanted to agree with the chair. I'm very concerned that when we are looking at our compensations around negotiations, we definitely need to make sure that we're not losing good employees to our surrounding county. So it's very important to us as a board that we look at that and make sure that you bring us back something that we can say we can do this, because that's important to us. I think at this point, we're at a stage now where we can make that priority. Thank you.
And that's that position of strength. When our salary is competitive, we're in a position of strength, then we can talk about reform.
Ms. Higgins?
Thank you. I think Ms. Boston rang a bell with me, and that we want to monitor closely is that apparently Montgomery County's school budget has $358 million just for music and art teachers. And if that goes through, you know where they're going to come looking. So if we could at least maybe cut off all communication with Montgomery County so that we don't, or whatever other kind. Yeah, that's right.
We're not going to invite them to Finance Park.
But, maybe have a party for our art and music teachers. I mean, but obviously with such a large amount of money, if that goes through, it's going to be a real threat to our arts programs. You're obviously nodding and, yeah. So vote no in Montgomery.
I guess since there's no other questions, could you just kind of go over the cost increases relative to workers' compensation? The workers' compensation component. The health insurance, I kind of get that, and maybe you could explain more around the retiree health, but I'm primarily concerned about the workers' compensation piece.
I'll be happy to speak to that. We've put this increase in there because we've been looking at some of the data. In fact, my team is in the process of looking at our risk management unit that I think is not really staffed sufficiently to deal with what's going on with our risk profile and managing our risk. Some of the data has indicated that over the last 3 years, we're seeing these costs really starting to spike. It's quite likely that this $2 million may go higher. We had a deficit last year. We're continuing to monitor that. I've tasked the finance department to work with Aon, who produces projections relative to what our workers' comp costs are going to be, Corvell, who is our third-party administrator that's administering those claims, and of course the county, who is in fact managing the fund for us. So all things put together, I think because of the fact that we're really hemorrhaging money, we've got to address that quickly. I'll be once I'm satisfied with the reorganizational plan that we're developing, I'll be talking to the superintendent, and hopefully I'll get a positive recommendation to come forward to the board. But that $2 million is in there because we are seeing dramatic increases in both in the claims, and when we've started asking some of the questions to get down to the granular level, simply like, if the number of employees has remained relatively constant, then are we finding a lot of singletons where the claims cost is 300% higher than the norm? And we're trying to get the data and figure out what's actually causing this cost spike. So we are paying attention to it. It's something to be concerned about, and I'll just leave it at that. It's something that we're very concerned about, and that's why we put some resources into the FY-14 budget to address it, and hopefully we won't have to come back. But I never say never.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think because oftentimes you got to sort of fix risk management, because sometimes it's not that I mean, that could be the case, but it's also sometimes we're just not as efficient as we could in making sure people have training and follow up and things like that. And then I guess my last question is back to the non-public placements. Are you prepared to talk about just kind of an overview of where we were last year, where we are now relative to the use? So, do we find that we're able to provide more services within the district? Are we sort of about the same in terms of non-public placements? Where are we on that?
So I'm a little surprised at this because our expenditures for non-public placements have been dropping consistently, and we've done a really good job, I think, of providing services in the district. So this one caught me a little bit off guard, but it sounds like the state is forcing that hand. We've actually been diverting money away from our non-public and into other areas of special ed. So I don't know what the state is thinking on this.
Okay. All right. Any other questions, colleagues? Wow. Okay. So we are, that concludes the questions for this session. We will adjourn until our public hearing, which is at 7. Dr. Carr, did you have anything else? Okay. So we stand adjourned until 7.